legal repeal took place, that Citigroup moved forward, and with all the disastrous effects we're now familiar with.
Close advisor, of course, to President Obama. And what about Larry Summers and Timothy Geithner in that?
Well, Geithner didn't have such a central role, but Summers was really involved in the Clinton administration in a lot of these key decisions. Geithner was in the Clinton administration, more focused on international issues. But Summers, for example, was a very vociferous opponent of regulating financial derivatives. There was an effort within the Clinton administration's executive branch to impose some really modest standards on financial derivative regulations, on financial derivatives, which at the time were beginning to explode but still weren't at the level that we are now familiar with. Summers, Rubin, and Greenspan banded together with Republicans in Congress, led by Phil Gramm, to prevent the efforts within the executive branch to regulate derivatives. And then in 2000, they passed a law, Congress passed a law, which Clinton signed into law, prohibiting the federal government from regulating these financial derivatives at all, with the result that not only are they not regulated, not only are they not required to register to show that they serve some social purpose before they're allowed onto the market, but no one has a sense of who owes what to whom. In the course of, we're bailing out AIG because they've engaged in so many of the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of these financial derivative arrangements. It's clear now that AIG itself did not know who they owed, who they were going to owe, who they'd entered into all these contracts for. They were engaged in such a wild speculative frenzy that they'd cut a deal with anybody. It turns out that the executives at AIG literally thought they would never have to pay out any money on these whatsoever. So they thought they were being paid to do nothing, money for nothing, we've called it. And it turned out to be wrong. Unfortunately, the money that's coming is not just from the AIG shareholders, but now to the tune of almost $200 billion from the U.S. taxpayer.
I brought up Glass-Steagall again because, well, I think it was 70 years ago. It was on this date or 75 years ago, that FDR was inaugurated and gave his Nothing to Fear But Fear Itself address. Rob Weissman, your current piece that talks about the amount of money that Wall Street poured into Washington, who did it, over how many years, this number, $5.1 billion?
Well, what we did is look at the entire financial sector. So it's the commercial banks, the investment banks, the insurance companies, the real estate companies, the accounting firms, all of whom are heavily intermingled now, by the way. Looked at their campaign contributions over the last decade. That totals more than $1.7 billion. They spent about twice that much, $3.4 billion, on lobbying. With the results that we're talking about. So more than $5 billion, and that is a way understatement on what they spent. It doesn't include the money they've poured in to state-level activities. It's a narrowly defined definition of lobbying, only people who are officially registered lobbyists. We saw that they had 3,000 separate people working as lobbyists for them in 2007. We looked at 20 different top firms in the financial sector. We found 144 who formerly had high-level positions in the U.S. government. I mean, it's epitomized by people like Rubin and Paulson, who came from Goldman Sachs, went into government, in Rubin's case, who went back into the private sector, and who were driving policy on behalf of Wall Street and the big financial sector to the massive detriment of the American public and, as we now know, really the entire world.
What are the recommendations that you make, Rob Weissman?
Well, the first thing is that all these deregulatory moves ought to be repealed. But beyond that, we think it's time for a big picture look at this stuff. And we're worried that although Wall Street is obviously on its heels right now, they're not absent from Washington. This lobbying activity is ongoing, including on a variety of small things being debated in Congress today. But in the big picture, we think we can't just get mired down in some of these details. The financial sector itself ought to be much smaller. In the preceding 3 or 4 years, the financial sector was taking about 1/3 of all corporate profits in the United States. It was way too big relative to the rest of the economy. It shouldn't be more than 10%. So it should be shrunk down. There's a range of activities that ought to be prohibited altogether. A lot of these exotic financial derivatives which serve no social purpose should be just banned. Any new instruments that are put on the market ought to be required to get pre-approval from government regulators, just the way a new pharmaceutical product has to get pre-approval, be shown to be safe, and serve some social benefit before it's allowed on the market. We ought to erect, again, regulatory walls and barriers that prohibit institutions from doing different kinds of things. Banks ought not to be engaged in these exotic derivatives. They should not be putting taxpayer-insured money at risk in this kind of stuff. Consumers need to be directly empowered to organize themselves so that they are a counterbalance to the influence of the commercial financial sector. And I think we ought to have a financial transactions tax, a speculation tax, so we slow down the level of speculative activity. That kind of tax would be highly progressive because it's only rich people who are engaged in mass transactions on Wall Street, bring in a lot of money, have major social benefits. And finally, I think if you look back over what happened in the last 4 or 5 years or the last decade, it's clear that a huge amount of money was made on Wall Street, but the firms themselves are now in complete crisis. They're needing the taxpayer money. Some of them are going bankrupt. They're being merged out of existence. So the companies themselves destroyed themselves. Why did they do that? What were the incentives that led them to take such crazy risks that they actually destroyed themselves? And it's very hard to avoid looking at the way individual people were compensated. They got massive bonuses, sometimes 5, 10, 20 times their regular compensation level, based on what they did in the previous year. So I think we have to have compensation caps, for sure, on executives and others, but even more importantly, the incentive mechanisms can't be that they get paid on how they did that year when they can manipulate it or they can benefit from a bubble. It has to be any compensation incentives that are going to be on the form of bonuses have to be tracked to very long-term performance by these companies.
Rob Weissman, President Obama got millions from the finance industry, one of his largest contributors. Do you see this regulation happening? We only have about 30 seconds. Where do you see the pressure come from?
Well, it's up for grabs. His advisors actually, of course, are very terrible on this. But we'll see. They're going to have to do something that's very serious and to restrain the financial sector if they hope to bring the economy out of the problems it's in. There were some good pieces in the budget. The financial sector is fighting them like crazy right now. For example, they want to eliminate the ability of companies to manipulate their taxes by relying on offshore subsidiaries. The insurance companies are going berserk and lobbying on Capitol Hill to try to stop that. The Obama administration, in this case, is trying to do the right thing.
Are the companies that are getting bailed out using some of that money to lobby in Washington right now or make campaign contributions?
Well, they're not using that money, but what's the difference? They're using some other money. So they're still very engaged. There's an effort, for example, right now to crack down on predatory lending. They are trying very hard to get that language eliminated from the appropriations bill.
Rob Weissman, thanks very much for being with us. His report is called Sold Out, How Wall Street and Washington Betrayed America. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Berkshire, Habakkuk, Aaron Mate. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.